coursework and stuff doing down too much. So that's depressing. So we just have a few announcements. If you haven't seen online, our Conversazione, also known as our annual formal, is going to be on the 12th of May. You can now pay for your tickets, which won't actually get the actual ticket until next week because we may have ordered them slightly late. But it's the principle that counts. So it's £30 for members and £35 for non-members, so it'll be in the Ulster Reform Club. Good crack, good excuse to wear a three-piece suit, or if you are into dresses, a really nice ball gown. So we should go to that. Next week is also our drafting competition. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically if you have spoken at any of this year's debates, you can all take part in this like super debate competition, and then we pick the best one of you and we say you're the best speaker in all of Queen's. So I know, because we are 100% qualified to do that. There's not actually a medal. There used to be, but it got lost like 50 years ago, and I don't know what happened to it. For further details, please see the minutes book where they talked about how they lost it. Also, we have our Bruges giveaway for our 700 Twitter follower. So we're almost there. I think there's about 7 more that we need. So if you haven't already followed us on Twitter, you should do that because there's a Bruges voucher in it for you. I think that's all the announcements from me. Is there any from other council members? No. Going once? Going twice? No? Okay. So I would now like to welcome Mr. Secretary-elect, Mr. Robbie Whitehurst, to take minutes.
Hello. The 20th Ordinary Meeting of the Litter Ethic took place on the 26th of March in the Senate Room and was attended by 36 members. Private members' business was accepted from Mr. Craig Miller, who asked the House about Prime Minister's political debate participation, and Mr. William Sinnott, who asked the House about the litter epithet flirting with people over Facebook. One of those was slightly more important than the other. President's questions were heard from Miss Worsley Morrison, Miss Marie-Louise Sinnott, Mr. Johnny Finlay, Miss Alex Philpott, Mr. Finn Rogers, and me. President Poyada then announced the evening's motion, "This House believes we should only give to the developing world." Ms. Bev Malcolmson opened for the proposition, stating that only giving to the developing world is in fact the most effective form of aid, given that 80% of the world's population inhabit the developing world. She explained that the top 10% of the world's most wealthy own 85% of the world's wealth, while the bottom 50% own just 1%. She agreed that Bono is a twat, and defined developing as meaning to live below the poverty line. She emphasised that in charity work, effectiveness, transparency and impact are key. She concluded by stating that all humans are of equal value and that we should not distance ourselves from other global citizens. Mr. Ethan McLaughlin then opened the case for the opposition, stating that money is needed not only by the developing world. He argued on a geopolitical basis that countries are defined as developing are not always those in need of aid. He asked the House who the money would go to in order to distribute it fairly. He concluded that charity makes up for failing government, charity does not make up for failing government and is not a solution. Mr. Kevin Nicholl continued the case for the proposition by arguing that to decide where our money is most needed and best used. He stated that there is more suffering in the developing world, that 19,000 children die needlessly each day, so the need is self-evident. He suggested that it is more effective to give to the developing world, where more good can be done for less money. He closed by arguing that all people are equal and that we should share citizenship and loyalty equally, regardless of distance. Mr. Finn Rogers then continued the case for the opposition. He stated that geography doesn't matter, although we aren't sure his views on various humanities subjects were relevant to the debate. Apparently, advanced colouring in won't solve world issues, but we knew. He argued that the most benefit to most people is to provide means, not merely funding. He concluded that our interconnected economy meant that we can't ignore the needs at home. Mr. Josh Milburn then closed the debate for the proposition, arguing that yes, governments in the developing world ought to do more, but we can't still ignore the suffering that is so evident. We can't just let people die, and so should not see charity as a mere stopgap. He claimed that morally we have the same level of duty to someone across the world as we do to someone on our doorstep. He concluded with the idea that famine and climate change are human-made problems and we therefore need to compensate for that. Mr. Jonathan Finlay then closed the case for the opposition and so the debate by stating that we need to focus on what we can do right here and right now. He lists examples such as cancer treatment, HIV, mental illness problems that also need to be tackled at home. He concluded with the thought that the phrase charity starts at home is stupid, and he was careful to emphasise that charity does not end at home either. The debate then moved to the floor, where questions and points were heard from me, Mr. Brendan Kellers, Miss Sophie Straffel, Miss Aisha Sobey, Craig Taxes Miller, written here, Dr. Stephen Goss, and Miss Gemma Cannon. A preliminary vote was taken on opinion, which read 7 ayes, 18 nays, 7 abstentions, while the casting vote based on speaking performance read 23 yeas, 23 ayes, 2 nays, and 6 abstentions. The motion was carried. Tannik in the minutes as read.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehurst. For those of you who didn't actually quite realise, my lovely assistant, Miss Alex Philpott, wasn't able to join us. That is why he's losing his secretary for Indonesia. Congratulations. So the next item on our agenda is private members' business. So this is basically where you can bring up anything you want to. It can be like a mini debate or just something random that you want to suggest to the society. So does anybody have any items of private members' business? Yes?
I don't really know much about it myself, but the Charlie Hebdo conference being cancelled for Queen's, just wondering if anybody had any opinions on either side of that, them cancelling it and
Yeah.
first time on it.
Yeah, no, you go ahead. I'd like to see on the BBC News there that it's been reconsidered again, so in 2 weeks' time they've made a decision. So if it goes ahead, it's going to happen the first week of June. So hopefully that happens.
In my limited knowledge of the whole affair, and from what I gather, limited knowledge is probably the expression most explains more or less the entire thing. For most of those who don't come to know anything about it, it seemed extremely strange what happened. An email went out essentially to all people who were going to attend the symposium, and it said, as a result of worries about reputational damage and security concerns, the symposium will be cancelled. Well, they'd already done a risk assessment apparently, which said there weren't really any significant security concerns, and no one's really sure what sort of risk, what the risk to the university's reputation was from running this symposium. It's a fairly sort of standard academic symposium. And in the process they managed to damage the reputation by cancelling it and making the university look rather, well, absurd, as if it is scurred easily by threats which don't really exist as strongly as they seem to think they do. So it strikes me as a very poor and very hard to understand decision. I still wonder if they ran out of money or something obscure like
that. As the Charlie Hebdo attacks have clearly seen, the free world is in dire need to stand up for basic liberties of free speech, which, as our own university is failing to defend its academics over these childish attempts to use violence to give authority to its own dying ideology, we should wholeheartedly try and hold the university to account and to make sure that no matter how controversial, no matter how offensive, the topics which are influential and relevant today are touched on by those in academia. I'll leave it at that.
Do you have any other points? No? Should I close this topic then?
The house is confused.
Any other private member business? Nope. Okay, so the next thing is President's Question Time. So this is basically where you can ask me anything you want if you're just curious. Are there any questions?
The surgery one.
Yeah.
Could Madam President tell us what she had for breakfast this morning and give a general synopsis of what she had for breakfast over the Easter period?
This morning was like one of those pizza twist swirl things with salami followed by a chicken burger and chips. And then my general breakfast over the Easter break was chocolate and cider and bacon. Moving on, any other questions? No? Okay, so before we get to the actual debate, we are going to play a little game. You might be familiar with it. It's called Just 3 Minutes. So, for those of you who don't know, it's basically going like a popular game, just a minute, except we do it for 3. So I give you a motion, someone will stand up and start speaking on it, and basically there's no hesitation, repetition, or deviation. So if the person speaking does any of those things, and anyone else can shout it out and then start speaking. Well,
I just thought maybe you want to make an announcement about the conversazione at the beginning of May.
Do you not remember that I did that? That is an excellent idea. So excellent that I actually already did it. But if you are listening, like our representative over here, our conversation is on the 12th of May. 35 for members, 35 for non-members. Please get in touch with me like that. Yes.
Wasn't there something you wanted to say with salmon? We have defrosting salmon at the event.
Oh, right.
Yes. Okay, so we had some trouble deciding exactly what we wanted for the menu, but basically if you want to go for the vegetarian option, it'll be a bit cheaper. I think it's about £27 for the vegetarian option, and the non-veggie option is going to be a steak main. But if you don't want either of those, you can go for the salmon option, but you have to tell us when you get your ticket if you want to go for salmon, just so we can order it. Yeah? Oh, good. Not forgetting anything? Sweet. So just 3 minutes. Back to that. So there's no hesitation, repetition, or as Oren just did, deviation. None of those things. It was also yes, don't go for a double whammy either. So if the person speaking does any of those things, call it out and then you will take over speaking. The person who's speaking at the 3 minute mark will win this lovely Bougie voucher. Yeah. Ooh. I know. Pretty fast. Okay, so I will just get the timer up. Okay, so the motion is this house believes superheroes do more harm than good. Okay, so who wants to start on that? I need somebody to do it. Yep. Red.
Well, I think there are broadly 2 reasons for believing that superheroes do more harm than good. The first of these 2 different causes in the mind so as to engender exposition of a certain position or belief is that the superheroes tend systematically to devastate the worlds in which they inhabit. They show complete disregard. I was going to say completely, and I repeated myself. So someone there challenge. Okay, never mind. No disregard whatsoever for the standard niceties of social order in these worlds. They destroy. No.
Superheroes clearly do more good than harm, because even though there might be a little bit of destruction and some carnage, ultimately they are saving the planet. If anyone saw the Avengers,
Deviation. You're supposed to be arguing why they do more harm than good.
No, you can speak on either side of the motion. Continue.
thank you.
I guess I accuse the whole house of deviation.
If anyone has seen the Avengers or Captain America the Winter Soldier, there was an enormous amount of chaos and people died in these films, but ultimately, without their actions, we would not have a planet to live on at the end of the day. It would simply be unthinkable to ban superheroes from doing anything whatsoever or requiring permission in advance. I mean, could you imagine Captain America sending a permission slip to the American government?
Repetition of permission. Okay. The second which I would say is indicates that superheroes do more harm than good is look at the morals they inspire in people. Superheroes routinely do what is supposed to be the good thing, but they never really make very clear what the good
Reputation
Next
of
of the world.
Well, I believe that as I stand up now, the real superheroes are not the ones in tight spandex. They are the ones who we read every day, like Shakespeare. This reminds me, speaking of the Winter Soldier, I call upon a certain play by William, which of course was the opposite of Summer's Tale, where the phrase "exit pursued by a bear" was uttered. And I believe that some man who could utter such a phrase would be the most superb person to take on the real enemies of the world. Speaking of the real enemies of the world, the Tory party. Damn it.
We don't let him win because he's got a timer. So the most important thing about superheroes is that they make us feel like someone's going to come along and save us, and no one is going to.
Timer again.
What timer?
Okay.
Nothing yet.
Just 3 minutes. We discussed this. That's a real guy. You can't use a timer. You can't play.
You have no proof. You have
You can't say
Did I use it? Did I use it?
Mr. Robbie Mikers, I'm going to find you.
I'm going to make you look so bad in these minutes.
We actually argue.
Yes, it's fine. I find you as official. Bring it next week. And yes, it was actually the next thing. And so just go over the rules of the debate first. We go by the Irish Times kind of style of debate, and that speeches are 7 minutes. Yeah, kind of 7 minutes long. So the first and last minute are protected, which means you can't ask any questions during that time. And I'll ring the bell after the first minute and before the last minute, which is how you know that you can ask questions in the middle. So it's up to the speaker themselves to accept an intervention. So you make an intervention by standing up and saying on that point. So if they accept it, please keep your intervention short so they can still have time to answer it and continue their speech. Right after they answer your question or address your point, nobody can then make an intervention immediately afterwards. So if you try to do that, it's called barracking. So someone's going to shout no barracking at you. So you just don't do that. So breaking the rules, and then you can get fined for that. It's bad thing. Don't be breaking the rules like some people like you mentioned. Right. Yeah. Where's going to this? We're going to start. Yeah, there's still more rules. I'm trying to remember them. No party, polemic, and no religious.
polemic.
No, there's something. They're not polemic. No religious stuff and no politics stuff. But also, and please be respectful of each other. It's just a debate. We're just here having a bit of fun. Okay, so the motion tonight is this House would curb China's enthusiasm. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Ben Murphy to open for the proposition.
Ladies, gentlemen, the House, China, the Red Dragon. For many years now, it has been slowly consolidating its influence and stretching its claws in more and more areas of the globe. Tonight, I will be arguing that China's enthusiasm is bad for us. It's just enthusiastic about too many different things. It's like that guy at your primary school is just a bit too much into arts and crafts, and you're like, that's kind of weird. Harry, on the other hand, discussing how China's enthusiasm is bad for Chinese people. So I will get underway with my first prompt of the argument, which goes something like this. The Middle Kingdom's insatiable appetite for territory, fossil fuels and new markets poses a grave threat to both political stability and the planet. I will begin by discussing China's worrying enthusiasm for land grabbing, followed by its increasingly concerning influence in African politics and infrastructure. This will aptly be followed by a discussion of China's overzealous consumption of imported fossil fuels. We begin, like all of the stories do, in Asia Pacific. Since before the rise of the Communist Party, China has aggressively pursued claims to the entire South China Sea, leaving few maritime boundaries and territories uncontested. Fueling mainland industrialization, the Communist Party of China has forwarded claims to the most ore-rich waters and used its economic clout to pressure its neighbours into accepting these claims. To this day, China maintains that Taiwan is part of China, even though it's an independent state. Ironically, Taiwan is still governed by the Chinese ruling government overthrown by the Communists in 1947, which submitted the original far-reaching claims to the South China Sea. In 2009, when the UN urged the South China Sea countries to submit territorial claims, no. The Communist Party submitted this original map drawn up by the previous government. Cast your mind back to 2012 when the Senkaku Islands dispute became particularly heated. Rival Chinese and Japanese fishing boats attacking each other, politicians verbally spar. While it may have slipped out of the Western public perception, China continues to flex its muscles. An Indian naval vessel on a friendly trip to Vietnam in 2011 was tersely informed by the Chinese Navy that it was in fact in Chinese waters, while in waters that they supposedly believed belonged to the Vietnamese. Such disputes have resulted in a region which is permanently on edge. Valerie McKay, a China analyst in the Paris-based Foundation for Strategic Research, says that even a minor naval collision or an accidental sinking, I'm not sure how things get sunk accidentally, but anyway, we can do it from there, could start something that could be difficult to stop. I'm not even sure what that means, but it doesn't sound nice. A further indication that it's serious about expanding its maritime territory, the maps the Chinese government prints in its passports now include both the South and the East China Seas. Because of this, Vietnam, for one, is no longer accepting these passports. Its border agents outright refuse to stamp them and now stamp separate pieces of paper. All of this paints a picture of a state which, I think you can agree, is over-enthusiastic to say the least in its territorial aspirations. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Is it not true that most of China's trade runs through this region of the South China Sea, and would it not be prudent as well for China to merely broaden its horizons in that region for the protection of its trade?
I totally agree that it should be allowed to broaden its horizons for the protection of its own trade, but to the extent that it wants pretty much an entire monopoly on the South China Sea, I think it's unreasonable for the states that it shares that water with. It's not the only one that has an entire claim to that sea. And this is just a narrative of the post-Cold War China, saying nothing of the past 50 years of its activities in Vietnam, Laos, Korea, Cambodia, etc. I turn now to Africa, where China has spent the last 2 decades solidifying ties with several developing states. China is now Africa's largest trading partner, surpassing the United States in 2009. In 2012, China's trade with Africa reached $190.5 billion, while US African trade in 2012 was only $99.8 billion. Yes, sir.
Your speech seems to be arguing that we ought to sort of curb China's enthusiasm. All implies can. Do you really think that it's within the power of, well, perhaps not this House, but the Western powers I suppose we're supposed to be representing here, to curb the enthusiasm of a growing superpower, who is growing rather faster than said Western powers are?
I do indeed, sir, because personally, I believe it's in our best interests to combat this monopolization of natural resources in Africa. While it may be beneficial to the African people right now, the Chinese system of authoritarian capitalism seeks only to benefit the richest elites within Africa. It will not benefit the African people or the Chinese people. That's what we generally used to do in colonial times, but what we've sort of moved on to and matured to an extent. Anyway, as I was saying, more than 80% of China's $93.2 billion in imports from Africa in 2011 were crude oil, raw materials, and ore, a figure that has increased markedly since then. 2009 is clearly a watershed moment then. Some of Africa's fastest growing economies, such as Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, are now increasingly choosing to do business with a government which cares very little about human rights, democracy, or state sovereignty. Misery acquaints the man with strange bedfellows. I will first, in fact, I'm not. The opposition, because I have so much to get through. The opposition might say that this investment is good for Africa, that we should welcome China's enthusiasm for investing in developing economies, but as I just said, the problem with this, however, is that China's investments have been almost entirely in the fields and ore industries and in infrastructure to supplement the transport of those minerals to mainland China. I re-emphasised my earlier point about 80% of China's imports being crude oil. This is a very much one-way relationship. China looks upon Africa as nothing more than a rather elaborate oil derrick. As a rather elaborate oil derrick. needing to fuel its mainland expansion, chuck a few $1 billion out in infrastructure out of its way, and the oil will keep flowing. I mentioned that material. I believe that my sentiments, are shared by David Cameron, who said in 2011, "I believe the authoritarian model of capitalism we are saying will fall short in the long term. When people get economically richer, they make legitimate demands for the political freedoms which come with their economic freedoms. This model, authoritarian capitalism within China, is unable to respond." I have mentioned that material resources are central to the feature to China's investment objectives and territorial disputes. This brings me to the issue of fossil fuels, where China's enthusiasm has far outstretched reality. When it comes to fossil fuel consumption, China is a full-blown state accounts for 50% of global consumption of coal, 10% of oil consumption, and accounts for 25% of net CO2 emissions. All this from just one state. If China's aspirations as a superpower grow, so too will its already unsustainable use of fossil fuels. They can never. China's over-reliance on fossil fuels has dire ramifications for beyond its borders. To keep within the safe limit of climate change, we have to maintain the 2-degree set by the IPCC. Probably include too many C's there. Anyway, to an extent, it is the West which is to blame for this. We have failed in international obligations, leaving newly economically developing nations open to exploitation by other world superpowers. The question remains, can China's enthusiasm be curbed? This scholars believe it can, though it involves curbing our own enthusiasm for certain vices like fossil fuels. We must show China and developing states that while fossil fuel trade may be profitable, it is far from sustainable. If we can help these economies shift away from fossil fuel exports, I believe we can make fossil fuels and power a far less source of enthusiasm for China as a world superpower. I urge you to vote for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy, and I'd like to welcome Mr. Oren Kennedy to vote for the opposition.
Right, well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with that kid who loves arts and crafts. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is worried about China, and admittedly for good reason. Let me be clear from the start. We of the opposition are not here tonight to defend the Chinese government and many of its actions that it takes. We are here to defend wise judgment. The proposition tonight will highlight just some of the reasons why China's growing prominence in global affairs is a cause for concern, and I cannot disagree with many of them. I too am concerned by many of the things the Chinese government is doing. They will try to convince you that we must take direct and immediate action to curb the threat it poses to the world. But their argument relies entirely on stoking fear and anxiety. They're trying to scare you into acting. They will tell you that if we don't do something now, it will soon be too late. The effects and outcomes of such actions, however, are of little concern to them. As long as it looks like we're doing something, anything at all, they're fine with it. By contrast, no thank you, the opposition, myself and James, we're going to present an argument that's based on clarity and rational thought. We will demonstrate how the potential actions suggested by the proposition are sadly misguided and covered by emotion rather than political acuity. I don't like the Chinese government any more than the proposition do. It's a brutal authoritarian regime that stands against liberal democratic values. But I strongly believe that we don't just have a responsibility to act, we have a responsibility to act in a way that's both right and effective. Let's start with economics and forms of indirect action. Economic sanctions or blocking trade is often seen as a way, as a most effective way for world governments to act by resorting to direct intervention. The argument runs here that China, a country whose economy depends heavily on exported goods, will be forced to change or face severe economic collapse. Rising unemployment would put pressure on the Chinese government to cooperate, or they would end up having to face revolt within their own borders. Yet there are very few cases in the past where you can identify where sanctions have been successful, at least on their own. History has taught us that sanctions rarely stop human rights violations and almost always hurt the poorest harder than anyone else. In this scenario, actions have an intended effect, but they also have unintended consequences. The political elites would remain unaffected, while poor workers would be severely hit. They would be hit severely and would eventually turn against the democratic Western government for help.
Should we be doing something against China in terms of the way they're actually stealing other companies' intellectual theft, like intellectual intelligence, right? And then they're competing on an unfair plane. American companies have got to actually invest heavily in R&D, and they just go ahead and steal it.
Well, I think that's more about what we have to do rather than taking action against China. If they're trying to steal from our governments, whether it's intellectual theft or anything of that nature, we need to heighten our own securities against them. We shouldn't necessarily think that the first thing to do is to go against China. Anyway, in reality though, seeing the Chinese economy deteriorate is in nobody's best interest. Most of you right here today have something on your person that was probably made in China, whether it's a smartphone or a computer or a piece of clothing. Simply put, our lifestyles are dependent on Chinese production. While it is deplorable to see such poor labour conditions, and the opposition supports improving, we support improving workers' conditions in China, sanctions will not achieve this. They will only increase unemployment and make an already difficult life even more intolerable.
What my colleague here has argued that most definitely, especially with the model of authoritarian capitalism they've employed, both the efficiency and speed of Chinese manufacturing is something to be impressive of. What we criticise is that this growth is to the detriment of everyone involved. It's a bubble which is prone to burst within this generation, and not only for our interest, but for Chinese interest, they must restrain it before everything collapses.
Well, that's the point. I think we really have to disagree, because I personally think that although there's a lot along with China, I believe that an economically prosperous region in Asia is ultimately to benefit the world rather than a stagnating economy in Asia that will basically not only make its own people suffer, but will come at our own detriment as well. Moving on to foreign policy, moves to isolate China in international institutions like the United Nations or diplomatic relations will prove equally catastrophic. In the past, Western governments have employed similar isolationist strategies, all with very mixed results. China frequently does use its influence to obstruct action in global affairs. I mean, just look at the United Nations Security Council. China regularly uses or threatens to use its veto power to strike down UN resolutions if it just infringes on anything which it fuses back. Yet while the situation is undoubtedly difficult, it would be nowhere near as calamitous as excluding China from the geopolitical realm entirely. The most positive changes in the country have come since it opened up to the world from the 1970s onwards. The limited democratic and capitalist reforms that have taken place in the country would suffer serious rollbacks as the Chinese government no longer worry how the rest of the world views practices. Never mind, I'm just going to get through this. Make no mistake, the Chinese government is deeply concerned about its image around the world. It carefully calculates its next move, bearing in mind how it will be perceived by friend and foe alike. If we isolate China, we are encouraging its government to stop caring and act with complete impunity. This will create avenues for flagrant abuses of power and the end of democratic reform entirely. We would effectively drive them into the arms of Russia, Iran, and other democratic governments around the world, even more so than they already are, effectively killing any chance of reform in the process. So in sum, tonight the proposition of presenting an argument that is both foolish and reckless not only would it destroy any hope of peace in the future, but it would also do significantly more harm than good for the people of China themselves. Yes, it would be wrong to ignore the clear violations of human rights propagated by the Chinese government on a daily basis, but we need to be smart about how we react, for this is one thing that we can control. If we act impulsively and with poor judgment, something which the proposition would have us do, we will rue a lost opportunity to transform China for centuries to come. We must stay, of course, continue to support liberal democratic values and the Chinese people as we do now. Change cannot be imposed from the outside, it must come from the people themselves. That is the message which I implore you all to take to heart tonight, and I encourage you to vote for the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I'd now like to welcome Mr. Harry Adair to close for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to tell you to develop Ben's argument on the criticism of Chinese growth. However, as he will mostly refer to the effects on us in the West, I will refer to its effects on Chinese citizens and its own economy. First of all, there's some criticism directed towards my points here. The economy slowing is not an optional one, and it is to our benefit. It is to our benefit. They're growing, but it is a bubble, and bubbles must burst. And slowing the economy is a requirement for a stable order, and it is also an economic reality for us due to the nature of the global financial system. And second of all, I take great displeasure to say that as long as the government in China is entrenched, it will suppress its citizens' demands for liberty. It is in their own interests that their cronies and party ideologues have a stable and secure position, not for them to have a representative government. So, in the end, we are playing into their hands by not taking actions. The Chinese communism is a deeply flawed beast. It represents the worst excesses of authoritarianism with the inherent instability of market capitalism. Such an equation, if left unchecked, will lead to internal instability, both economic and social. It is a twin-headed hydra, pulling the great Chinese dragon in two different directions. One towards much control over private life, and another one over economic stability. The economics behind communist China are equally broken. Structural deficits, lack of consumption, housing bubbles in both the domestic and foreign spheres all threaten to send China back 50 years without the structural benefits of the free world's international order, which is, as I will say, rigged in our favour. Second, the shadow banking industry, which threatens to implode China's economy, is becoming increasingly dependent on its own financial growth. It's the chicken and the egg. Which one goes first? If you have a look at capitalism through the authoritarian lens, it very closely resembles a system with tremendous pitfalls. If people's faith wavers in its own state, the economic institutions, such as the industries and the new financial investment banks in the South Seas, are tied directly to that faith in its own government. This is a recipe for disaster, and it is a nation which gets its authority from constantly making its citizens afraid of its own authority. It is inherently unstable. China's total national debt is equivalent to 282% of its GDP, creating major fears for would-be investors in its state industries of a domino effect of multiple critical state industries going south, which will cause a second credit freeze, the like of which both us and Chinese citizens will have never seen. Go ahead.
If having a big debt to GDP ratio makes you so unstable you're going to implode entirely, then so is the entire planet.
This is why we need to constrain it. This is why we need to, not just us, but the Chinese citizens with faith in their own government. Since 1998, the government has allowed citizens to own their own homes, and the middle class has snapped up an inventory and has created demand for private housing. Not because there is any particular demand for this housing, but because there's few other options for investment. Government state banks have very low interest rates, with returns that are simply untangible and not in tune with market values. And this has pushed house prices through the roof due to the fact that demand has artificially been increased. The McKinsey Global Institute stated, a plausible concern is that the combination of an overextended property sector and the unsustainable finances of local governments could result in a wave of loan defaults in China, damaging the regular banking system and potentially creating a wave of losses for investors and companies that have put their money in shadow banking industry vehicles. Now that is something I'm sorry, I need to get through this. So, I've touched on this, but the evolution of shadow banking lending reflects the Communist Party's twin-headed struggle between the imperative for economic growth and its need for financial and social stability in controlling those industries. Wealth management, the popularity of such projects has vastly soared since 2012. At the end of 2011, 1 to 2% of total lending was from them. And at the end of 2012, over 9 million yuan, or like 10% of local deposits, were in shadow banking industries. And this coincided perfectly with Beijing's implication of restrictions on state-owned government banks lending for property projects. This is no coincidence. This is the result of the meddling which the central government has had in its own economy. And this is closely linked also to a large real estate construction project, which has been the key growth in China's economy since the 2009 financial crisis. In turn, the rise of wealth management projects as a means for state-owned banks to gain a greater foothold in the market reflects the central government's shifting efforts to manage the imbalances and risks inherent to a credit and property-driven economy. I'm sorry, I do need to finish this. Unless Beijing can shift the economy away from an over-reliance on lending and credit, a process which will surely require significant boosting of domestic consumption, something which ideologically they want to move away from, these products, along with beta imbalances, only temporarily hide these problems, and they will continue to grow as far as the state will allow it. In addition, the international sphere only benefits us. The Chinese yuan, while made great strides in the last 2 years, is only 2.2% in international payments. For comparison, Great British Pound is 10%, and the United States dollar is 50%. This is not competition. This is something else. To review, about half of the debt of households, firms and government is either directly or indirectly tied to real estate. Rapid growth in lending by local governments, many of which, as has been stated, many of which will not be able to repay. And third, around a third of total outstanding debt in China is provided by a highly opaque shadow banking industry made up of various forms of non-bank lending. The Chinese dragon is a shallow projection of its own insecurities, of this inherent insecurities of central planning. Ideologically pinned to a corrupt and dying order, it is projecting outward, trying to influence other states to steal their resources. To appear in reality as strong, it is hollow. I encourage the House to vote for this motion.
Thank you, Mr. O'Dara, and I'd like to welcome Mr. James Ignani to close the debate.
Alrighty, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, comrades and friends. 2 quick points. First of all, I didn't realise how Orientalist his t-shirt looked when I heard the No comment was intended. Secondly, I don't know how to debate except to have this mass of papers in front of me, so the House will have to bear with me as I attempt to organise my own mind. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few points of rebuttal before I get into my own speech. First of all, I don't think it will escape the attention of the House, being an educated group, that the opposition has failed to define our points or to actually add conclusions to our arguments. They've essentially used a parade of horribles to say China is bad and treats its citizens badly and doesn't do good things in foreign policy, to which the opposition says heartily, yes, and so what? And to the so what, we have received no reply. We'll get to that more later in the speech. Just 2 quick points I'd like to pick up on. First of all, as mentioned by our first proposition speaker, China's engaging in a sort of form of neo-colonialism. Now, I don't know if that's quite true, and I'll expand on that in just a second. But first of all, considering the Western world has for 60 years economically structured the system of capitalism so it oppresses and steals the third world's money, I'm not sure it's I know thank you very much. I really don't think we ought to be criticizing China too heavily. Secondly, infrastructure projects are actually helpful to the developing world. Now, I think it's something like 3/4 of all aid projects fail because of insufficient transportation, especially because of lack of highways. The fact that China has carpeted Central African highways is going to help people survive. I'm not saying Chinese government is good or American dictatorships are good, but that's something we ought to keep in mind. Secondly, the argument about the environmental policy being unsustainable, again, is totally true, but it's really a prop for a different debate. We need to scientifically solve the problem of unsustainable energy usage, and for some, I don't know why it follows, but because China's policy is just as bad as ours, we somehow have to engage in more coercive policy. So yes, the opposition hasn't defined what it is rebutting China's enthusiasm is, except what it seems to be some kind of more strongly minded response to them, perhaps using coercive force or economic sanctions or diplomatic sanctions. We think that doesn't make sense on this side of the House. And we think that Oren has made some very good points in that regard already. And I'd like to expand upon them in 3 ways, if the House would bear with me. First of all, I think China is already too integrated into the global system to be removed from it or to be shunned from it without undue harm, effectively undue harm caused to the global system. Secondly, I think the best way to help political reform in China is to be politically and diplomatically and economically involved in China, and curbing its enthusiasm doesn't make sense. And thirdly, I think the future of China is impossible to predict. It's too big a country with too many unknowns. So moving quickly on to my first point, China's already a huge international player, as it was pointed out in the first speaker's speech. The third of all, China is invests hugely. In our own country, Britain, China is one of the largest sources of FDI, foreign direct investment. As of 2007, it was over £1 billion. That can't be removed without harm being caused to the United Kingdom. So the question then becomes, is that a good idea? Again, we haven't received a prop as to why it would be a good idea, so I don't know why. But once again, I've already waited on 1/7 of the world's population and a huge part of the world's manufacturing sector exists in China. To try and remove them from a global economic system will cause huge problems. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, I'm saying I think we have to think carefully about it beforehand. We rely on China's cheap manufactured goods. We should reform Chinese labour, by the way, but we ought to do it in a sustainable manner. It's too big to ignore, and to disengage from China is to disengage from reality. Secondly, right, we've heard the phrase China's record in human rights. China doesn't have a record in human rights because the Chinese government doesn't believe in human rights. You're not allowed to say it. If you're an academic, you're not allowed to write about it. It's awful. Look at what's happening in the Uyghur regions of the Xinjiang region of China. Look what's happening with any kind of insane overreaction the Chinese state has to any kind of mention of protest for human rights. So we on this side of the house, and I'm sure everyone in the house, wants to find a way of helping, because the Communist Party of China is terrified of dissent. It has a whole, I think it was 3 years ago, formed a massive department of academics to study revolutions worldwide so that we could prevent them happening in China, especially if focusing on the Irish Spring. It's China's most pressing and yet most ignored issue, and we want to find how we can help. Well, first of all, disengagement is a no. Not having a say, not having an impact upon China's state or within China's people, not having our economic goods flow into their country, we don't see how that actually helps China engage. No, thank you. Doesn't help China improve politically. Secondly, we don't believe the British state, because we're talking about Great Britain, or Western powers states have much of a role. It's very hard for a state to try and maintain realpolitik to improve the political and human rights conditions of the nation. We think the only true way is for citizens, like members of this house, funnily enough, to try and help Chinese citizens. Now that sounds a bit pie in the sky, but there are some very real things. For example, spreading literature is hugely important. There's a reason why authoritarian governments around the world banned 1984 in the works of Kafka, and it's not because they think we're a bit like twee and overwritten and overwrought. It's because I'll take your point now.
It seems that the opposition are sort of arguing for, like, we will curb your enthusiasm, but just a tiny bit, and the proposition, like, you have this idea that the proposition is going, we have to do it right now, get it done then. How do you respond to, are you trying to curb it just not as in an extreme way?
Again, as a perhaps we believe that China doesn't want to be curbed quite so much as it needs to be dealt with intelligently. We think the Chinese state is not something we like, but we want to help Chinese citizens. So I'll point out in the proposition state that Chinese citizens are suffering immensely. Moving quickly on to my third point, since I'm running out of time. China's far too unpredictable as power to try and make these broad suggestions, but will never reform democratically. Hong Kong protests, the environmental protests, the crackdown on corruption, things nobody saw coming, least of all members of this house. We don't know where it will develop, but by staying engaged, we'll be in the right position to aid the creation of the China we want to see. China's important, and it's only going to become more so as we continue throughout this century. The word China encompasses 1/7 of humanity, a rich history, a fascinating culture, and huge potential. The Chinese state today is a nightmare. Ignoring that nightmare will not help it pass, and we do not believe that a case has been made to this house of how ignoring it will. We argue with this house is often recognise the reality of China's influence around the world, and as we attempt to aid the forces within China, because they certainly exist, and we act with greater enthusiasm than we can imagine, who are attempting to change their country. These are the reasons why we beg you to oppose this motion. Thank you all very much for your time.
So now I'm going to move the motion to the point, please say your name just for the minutes. And once the side has addressed your point, we're going to go to the other side, so both sides can address the point, but then there will be no back and forth allowed. We'll just immediately move on to the next one. Okay? So do you have any questions for the proposition?
I suppose the second speaker for proposition in particular made a very interesting point, which is the Chinese growth model, which has been historically very heavily predicated on labour that's insanely productive because it's very, very heavily underpaid, has now exhausted, and also picking up technological innovations from the money made off of the back of that labour, has now more or less run out. Chinese growth has fallen to, actually at the moment it's running more or less comparable to the UK, which is catching up in its own weird way. But that's bizarre. 5 years ago that would have been impossible. Now, the proposition seems to take that point and then says from it, okay, so then we should now curb China's enthusiasm because it's got a bad economic growth model. Well, firstly, we didn't curb America's enthusiasm, and it had a bad model in 2006. But secondly, whenever you attack somebody who has a shaky economy because their growth model has run out and trying to find a new way to fit into the world and get that geopolitics to work out, whenever you attack them directly through sanctions or by making various amendments which attack, remember China has a very strong sense of national identity. It doesn't like foreigners telling it what to do. It's had too long a history of that happening. Whenever you do things like that, you create instability and you create problems. And although the opposition has argued that the Chinese government is awful and needs to be gotten rid of, and instability will get rid of them perhaps, actually I think that is not necessarily a good thing. Remember, even a democracy can fall to Hitler. You don't want to inflame passions. You don't want to destabilise anything like China in the world. So I do wonder, why on earth do you think we should make these measures to curb its enthusiasm and try and control it?
Well, we're not trying to control it. I'd like to first congratulate the second speaker of the proposition for pulling off the greatest hoodwink of this audience I've ever seen, tacking on methods of curbing China's enthusiasm. At no point in my speech or Harry's speech we actually advocated, so congrats, sir, on that straw man. What I would say is, when I'm saying this house would curb China's enthusiasm for the shadow banking industry, what I'm saying is they have made the exact same mistakes that we have, and the problem with China's being such an economic powerhouse in exports is that anything that affects them affects us doubly so. And the Eurozone in particular being on its knees, the proposition being this house thinks we ought to curb China's enthusiasm, at least for that aspect of their economy. I think it's a fair proposition. I think it's a fair proposition to advocate that we prevent quite possibly a global banking crisis that makes the 2008-2009 look like absolutely nothing in comparison.
Okay, first of all, just a quick point of rebuttal. My point of my speech was when you didn't finish your arguments, not whatever you thought I was saying. Secondly, on the point the questioner made, I don't think instability is in and of itself a good thing, and I think it's prescient to make a point about the Weimar Republic. Okay, to bore everyone with history for a second, I think the reason the Weimar Republic fell was because there were a lot of interests that weren't destabilised enough, and were a lot of powerful state interests that leveraged Hitler into power at a time when the Nazi Party was waning at best. But destabilisation of China isn't what we want, but it's what we on the opposition believe is going to occur if we try and take a stronger economic or diplomatic or military stance against them. Again, I'm not saying this to try and sound cool. I don't know what's being proposed by the other side of the house, so I don't know how we're going to be affected. But we do agree with them that bad economics and bad banking are bad. So yeah.
Do we have any questions for the opposition? No one else? Okay.
Let's see. You propose that we should not curb China's enthusiasm, but rather take a more smarter stance to China in its sort of ways. I've got two questions, I suppose, that follow from that. The first question is, what do you mean by China? Are you talking about the state of China, the Chinese government, or are you talking about the Chinese people? So there are two very different entities. It struck me you recommend lots of plans for improving the conditions of changing, curbing the enthusiasms of for fossil fuels, etc., of the Chinese people, curbing the enthusiasm for supporting the government that they have at the moment, etc., etc. But you did not advocate many targeted at the Chinese government. So if you define China in those terms, then it strikes me you've sort of made the proposition's argument a bit. On the second point, I've forgotten what I was going to say, so I will let you do it first.
On that point that we made the proposition's argument, I don't believe we did, because I don't believe the proposition actually presented an argument at all tonight. I think that much of their speech was actually just statistics on facts that we all know and that we don't necessarily think are good. But they didn't necessarily themselves say how they were going to deal with the problem. And so I kind of think in that regard, I can't say we did make the proposition's argument. I think that we presented our own very smart argument. No offense. On this idea of defining China, okay, well, I think it often will depend on the circumstance in which we're talking. So when we're discussing that we do not condone, say, China's human rights violations, or we don't condone their anti-democratic stance, I think that largely speaking we might be referring to the Chinese government as opposed to like every Chinese person, because obviously you can't just speak for every Chinese person in China.
Not trying hard enough.
But then I suppose in other circumstances with regards to helping with regards to helping, say, China, helping the Chinese people, like, the point was made that literature is extremely important and the spreading of ideas cannot be underestimated. With regards to that, it would be a discussion of the people of China as opposed to the Chinese government, because the Chinese government are clearly opposed to such measures. They do not want the dissemination of literature. So I suppose it's difficult to say. There's an answer, but there's also a non-answer in that I can define China, but it pretty much will depend on the context in which I'm speaking.
There seems to be some sort of skirmish going on here, whether the meanings are about my speeches, so I'll say it myself. Neither me or Ben felt necessarily the need to define exactly what it is to curb their enthusiasm, simply the need to, not only for the West's interest, but for the Chinese people. And following on from that, that would mean I would define China as its government, due to the same reason. They're the ones making these foreign expeditions into Africa. They're the ones who are supporting the fishers in the South Seas. But I do think we should take a more proactive line. Not saying them necessarily as opponent, but we do have our institutions which are being undermined by the creation of new ones. I know the TIIB, which was founded last quarter, is attempting to exert more influence rather than the International Monetary Bank. I don't think either us or the proposition are in disagreement that Western institutions such as these do have their own self-interest in investing in American economies and trying to make it dependent on our Bretton Woods system. But what we wanted to put is that we don't need to throw away all our cards on the table simply because they're getting the better of us now in places like Africa. What we need to do is to actually bring them in to our sphere of influence using like the soft measures which have been proven extremely effective in Western Europe. Yes, why? Well, because it's a government that's not attached to human rights, and it's a government that is ideologically opposed to the individualism. So why should we let them take over order whenever we have shamelessly exploited for 50 years? Surely we should be the ones leading the way and getting a new example against it.
Just on the motion, so neutral points. Yes, Alan?
Hello. Are there any countries whose enthusiasm we should encourage.
Okay, proposition, do you want to address that first?
Newly economically developing nations like the ones I mentioned in my speech, such as Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, stuff like that. Yeah, but not along the lines of Chinese oil hegemony.
Okay,
I think, like, with regards to like most, we should be encouraging the development of most nations to be enthusiastic. I mean, I understand that with every country there may be some problems. So, with regards to say encouraging, say in Russia or in China or under some African dictatorship, there's obviously going to be a difficulty in encouraging every single thing that they promote. But at the same time, promoting the global economy, promoting promoting just a better developed world is surely something to be enthusiastic about. I don't think we should discourage any country per se unless it really is something along the likes of North Korea, in which case I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, so any questions for the proposition? Yes? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you curb the enthusiasm in terms of energy consumption for 1.1 billion people?
Well, as I said in the last paragraph in my speech, it's there on the record for anyone to read. I will repeat it for posterity. We must show China and developing states that while fuel trade may be profitable, it is far from sustainable. We can help these economies shift away from fossil fuel exports by leading by example. We are the number one, America at least, I'm not American, so speaking from the perspective of the West. We must lead the way in showing that sustainable economies based on green energy are far more, while fossil fuels may be profitable, they are by no means sustainable. Sustainable economies are the way forward. China may have exponential growth in comparison to us. They may even overtake us at one point in the future based on oil and fossil fuel powered economies, but they will not last. That is the whole point of the argument. I apologise if it took me this long to actually get all that out in the open. You can applaud me if you want. But that is the crux of our argument.
I think it's a good point. I'm born in a house, but like how we deal, because China uses so much power, partly because it manufactures so many goods on a secondary level, and that's a huge problem, and it's one that we need to research and need to try out practical solutions to. But at least I don't see them being tried, and I think the West as a sort of concept is best equipped to research for it, and I don't think we're doing it. We're investing anywhere near as much as we should to have a mind solution.
Okay, so any questions for the opposition? No? Okay, so any just points on the motion?
I just like to see what your response would be if this was happening in China and they were saying we should curb the West's enthusiasm for our human rights or distributing literature to our citizens and our government wouldn't like, or our use of resources which is not allowed, etc.
Well, naturally this wouldn't be happening in communist China because the only morally right point of view is the point of view of the free market economy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I said it is a good point. First proposition speaker is a good point. You could have a debate in China, but if we did, I'm going to try and win the debate. Past anyone's perception, not pointing to a prop side, but I am. The things I say here are to try and win the argument. Sorry. It's a good point, no, actually, because whereas there's a different Chinese way of looking at it is like democracy and freedom. And it is different. I think these ideas are transferable. I'm not such a relativist, but I think China doesn't have a concept of democracy. Quite the opposite. But I think it would certainly make for an interesting cultural exchange, and I would like to continue that exchange and not shut China out.
Okay. Any questions for the proposition? Yeah.
If you take a case study of China's influence in Zambia,
you'll see that over the last 20 years that they've been very reliant on copper prices. And as a result of that, effectively, since the Chinese have influenced the Zambian economy, there's been an increase in life expectancy of about 15 years. Okay, so it's gone up from about mid-40s to very late 50s, since the Chinese have sort of come in and stabilised copper prices and told them what to actually do in their economy. So you're saying to curb Chinese enthusiasm, but there's clear cases, it's just one I know of, where they've gone into a country, they've stabilised the economy, right? And it's something that the people there are benefiting from and will do long term because they've changed their copper-dependent economy into things based on agriculture and cotton.
My response to that would be we don't really. It's only really been recently that China's really taken its great leap into African affairs. So certainly there are success stories. My mum was in Uganda recently, and all the roads there, they're Chinese administrated, they're Chinese maintained, and it was constructed on the behest of Chinese engineers. So there's no doubt that this policy is succeeding in some regards, but what happens whenever they get monopolies over economies? The problem with infrastructure and raw resource-based economies is it tends to flow. It doesn't necessarily benefit the people there, even if what happens whenever there is no competition to Chinese cheap manufactured goods, then local industry starts to die. It just simply can't compete. But what I would say then is we don't necessarily need. It's not like it's a game where China goes up and then the West starts to lose influence everywhere, lose economies. We're very much tied to it. So when it comes to something like Africa, what there needs to be is a more long-term approach to this, because otherwise it is most certainly in their interest that they can extract them using resources. But my question would be, is that any different from European colonies, which did certainly improve local education and infrastructure, but that was for the sole reason to extract natural resources, and that has not actually led to a long-term growth plans after they left, really. But yeah, I'm just saying it's not clear right now whether their influence is entirely positive.
Yes, sorry, just to add to Harry's point, as I said in my speech, David Cameron highlighted that, one of the rare occasions that I actually agree with David Cameron, that is a short-term advantage. Yes, of course that's going to appear. Yes, of course life expectancy is going to increase. But the price the Zambian government has paid for that is that vast ways of their infrastructure are owned by the Chinese state. The Chinese state now has a foothold in their politics. What happens when, as David Cameron said, those Zambian citizens ask for democratic rights that equate to the economic rights that they've just gained? What I'm saying is, and what David Cameron reiterated in 2011, is that as a long-term strategy, that authoritarian capitalism cannot win. It will not win because the people will not accept the lack of democratic rights that entails.
Would you like to respond?
Trying to figure out what it was. It was quite long. No, I kind of fully agree. I believe that pointing out the examples of this Chinese investment has promoted many good things within the case study you raised in Zambia. I think that just reiterating the point that was made in the debate, China is a very big country and it's very difficult to predict the future that's going to happen. And when it comes to its arrival on the global economic stage, it's still very, very young. And I think that discussions about curbing its overall enthusiasm, just at a point before we've actually seen any real results or we've seen any thing that we can make a good, solid, wise judgment on. I mean, I'm not going to stand here and deny that there is no reason. I'm not going to say there's no reason to be concerned whatsoever, because frankly, there are reasons to be concerned. But at the same time, I'm not going to say the immediate thing we should do is just go and try to stop it from investing or stop it from growing, because I don't believe that's a viable solution. I think that in order to present a good argument, we need to let it develop in an international economic stage. And Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure. I kind of lost track of my argument.
Quick questions for the opposition. Yeah.
I suppose I'll offer one now. There was a point which I don't think was really made by the proposition, but I think it probably follows from an interpretation which they were not taking, so I think I'll make it myself. The point is, one of the things, I mentioned earlier, a lot of this depends on what you define China as, whether you're talking about China as its people or China as the state of China. Now, one of the things that both of those two bodies have been moving towards recently, with the encouragement of the Chinese state, the Chinese people are the ones acting it, is moving much more towards a modern consumerist economy. So the Chinese growth model, as has been brought up, has been running into trouble. The idea is to move to a more Western, sort of US-style growth model where everyone buys lots of goods and consumes a lot more. Now, I actually have a question. This is perhaps the big enthusiasm of China at the moment on a day-to-day level. Just like everywhere else in the world, everyone wants nice things. Is this a particular... I would certainly say that in the West, this is a very unhealthy fixation, which has been disastrous for the environment and for those people who have to supply the raw resources to make said nice things, and indeed the Chinese labourers who've made them. Now, I'd like to ask, do you think that we should act to, besides curbing our own enthusiasm in that regard, also curb China's enthusiasm for this move towards consumerism for the same reason? Because it's not good for those who are involved, who end up getting involved in it.
Well, I can respond. Sure. This move towards modern consumerism in today's society, overall, it is a bad thing in many ways, and it is something that is unsustainable and it is causing tremendous environmental damage. But at the same time, it can also be considered a good thing so long as it is regulated, so long as it is controlled. I mean, promoting consumerism, promoting a capitalist economy can lead to economic growth. It can lead to a better society. I'm not saying that we're not trying to argue that there aren't any problems attached with that. Whenever you're talking about consumerism, it's going to be a problem for every society that introduces consumerism. It's not necessarily something that's unique in the United States. It's something that would happen everywhere. I mean, it's happening in Europe, it will happen in Africa, it will happen in South America. It's going, the modern consumerist ways is sort of the way that we're all heading. So I believe that, I'm trying to gather your point again. Are you saying that is this something that we should be encouraging? Or?
No, I'm saying if you think we should try and act to curb that, why do you not also think that we should act to curb that in China?
Right, okay. Well, I don't believe that it is something that we should necessarily... I don't believe it is something that we should scratch entirely. Again, it's something that we need to think carefully about. We can't necessarily just say consumerism is bad, therefore we should remove it. It's, as with all of these things, they need to be carefully monitored. They need to be, regulated in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean that another country then it doesn't necessarily mean that we have the right to say, look at an example like China and say, well, this is bad, you're practicing it, but it's okay if we're doing it. Again, I think I'm kind of losing track of what I'm trying to say. I'm not doing well. Do you want to step in?
It's very brief, but I think the problem with consumerism is it's partly like a philosophical one to the entire world we grapple with and avoid the level of consumption we want. So I'm concerned about too, if that's questioner's point. And I think it needs a worldwide response, and artificially excluding 1/7 of the world isn't the best way to go about tackling it.
Well, notice the words that are being used. Control, try and contain what is slowly evolving into a US-type consumerist state. Those are curbing its enthusiasm in moving to that model. I'm happy you brought that up because I actually cut it because I didn't think I had enough time. But this is something that we have been seeing in the last 3 years, and it's kind of ramped up with the anti-corruption campaign recently, where they're trying to kind of have a hands-off approach to certain government industries while letting in the gaps private industries go, and at the same time moving away from that collectivist model. That's what I tried to get in with the twin-headed hydra. You have the one which is trying to move to market reforms and trying to like encourage that US hegemonic consumerist style, and instead of America with China doing all the manufacturing and raw resources, China is trying to be more consumer driven while exporting manufacturing to lower wage countries in the Southeast Asia and Africa. What I said is, this is what we have done, it's not sustainable. And so to that end, not only does the US and the West need to control their enthusiasm for being very manipulative in these economies, we also need to control China's, because they are now really the largest actor in this regard, and they're the one that still has the old ways very much written in, and is politically unique in that it has that two interests at once. However, unlike the West, China's kind of outside the Bretton Woods global order. They're trying to set up their own ones, and I'm saying we need to control their enthusiasm for doing this, because it's kind of barging its way in on a previous international order and moving the whole international order, one which is more I will say a little less consumeristic, while at the same time less authoritarian is the way forward. And to that end, every country needs to control its enthusiasm for this, land grabbing, fishing boat sinking attitudes. That's that.
Okay, so any points just on the motion?
Very much. So I don't think it's very constructive placing Chinese enthusiasm as a zero sum against everybody else. I think it's only right for the Chinese exert their influence in the region, obviously because of the key major player there. They're obviously avoiding the appalling Chinese human rights record. We must look at Chinese history as well. China has a very good history in regards to foreign interventions, depending on how you look at the Korean War as well, the Elder Rivers. However, China has never offensively invaded any country as far as the war. I'm not correcting any historians, but we have to look at this here as well. Chinese history is one of not getting involved to any military extent, certainly in foreign nations, but merely exerting its power within this region. And I'm very certain that that's a break with US policy and Western policy in general, especially when considering the extent of US neo-imperialism as well as obviously imperialism here in the UK as well.
Opposition, do you want to address that first?
There's very individualist attitudes, and America is the world police. It's not new. Britain was very much interested in controlling global affairs with a moralistic view. I'll bring up the example of the slave trade in particular. The Royal Navy very large fleets both off the coast of Zambia and the whole. They effectively blockaded the western coast of Africa. This was carried over with the land lease deals to America, pretty much abdicated in the Cold War scenario, where now America does control the majority of the world's sea lanes and stuff, which is critical for international shipping and why it's so cheap, really, because that's on the US dime. But China is trying to take a piece of that itself. There's the idea of the new Silk Road, where they are building large infrastructure networks across Eurasia, effectively, trying to establish links both with Eastern Europe, with both the Middle Eastern countries along the way and European consumer markets, which are essential for their new consumeristic style of growth, even if their reliance on manufacturing has decreased to some degree. So it's not. You are right. It's very different from America, which tends to use the toss out a government, one which is friendly to us. even though it's not necessarily democratic, if we bring in our specific style of liberal marketism, they'll move towards liberal democracy. So it's more ideological, not necessarily economic, even if it's very caricatured in that way. I bring up the example of South Korea, which a liberal dictator put in during the war, but that had a authoritarian thaw and moved towards the thriving democracy in Southern Korea today, as well as a thriving economic situation.
Tear gas in the parliament.
What?
They threw tear gas in the parliament.
It's not that bad. What China is doing is different. It is using that soft power and is enthusiastically using its economic capital, which is a major part in international finance now. I brought up the example of shadow banking, but as an unstable, as kind of like an unstable link in that armor. But make no mistake, it's important. But their ideology is not towards one of participation in government and individualism. It is towards single party control, as well as the stability of their regime. I'd say more so towards that now because it has shifted away from ideological communism towards more single party Maoism. But and of course, it's the financial support of its major backers in key government industries. So I'd say, even though it definitely emulates parts of that early policy, I will say that that kind of American world police style thing is growing out of date in a multipolar system. I don't think China has the influence to actually become the world police. It has a large debt problem. It has inefficient industries, and while certain corruption has gone down, it's still a key problem simply due to the fact that it still has these central planning restrictions, which push all that economic influence into government-supported industries, which I've highlighted might be a problem in the future. So it very well might. I'm sorry, briefly. It very well might, but my problem is it's gone. Everything at once. It's trying to take all the pieces on the chessboard at once, and that is not going to go well for either us or them.
Very quickly, I'm trying my stations. 3 quick points, all of which relate to the theme of me being pretentious. Okay, first of all, British Empire only stopped trying to enforce the stop the slave trade after it spent 200 years creating it. So it's not it's not as moral as it was made out. Secondly, America. The reason it has such an interventionist policy, I think, is because it suited America's international interests. American power was built off a international capitalist system with the third world a supplicant supplier of tertiary goods, which is why it had to intervene so often whenever things didn't look its way. Thirdly, history is really great. I study it, but it's not it's not the best guide for the future. I don't think you can make predictions. China, throughout its history, has not had to intervene because it's had a massive area to govern, and China hasn't been autonomous without being a dictatorship while it's had a modern state. So we don't really know how China's going to act. That was one of the themes, I think, of my speech in Orange. We don't know what China's going to do in the future, but we certainly will have some influence on it and be engaged with them. So, yeah.
It's hard to tell if he's going to cover it up. He started with an idea and then it's just turned into a weird. Clear that one up. Okay, we'll just go through a vote now. Just before we do, a reminder that next week is our different competition. So if you have spoken at any of your debates, you should totally go for it. It's totally awesome. Get the award, and it looks really cool on your CV and not weird at all. And of course, our competition is on the 12th of May. You can buy tickets from any council members. Okay, so we're going to take 2 votes. The first one, everyone can vote on this one. It is your own personal opinion. So if you agree with the motion that this House would curb China's enthusiasm, please raise your hands and say aye.
Aye.
6, Madam President.
Yep. And agree with you there. And if you disagree with the motion, please raise your hands. Say nay. Raise your hands again.
It's a very violent style country.
Sure, 13.
It's 13.
Absolutely.
And if you don't really have an opinion on it and want to abstain, please let me know. Some people don't not your vote to worry.
5, Madam President.
Okay, and the next vote is for members only, so I'm going to need you to get out your membership cards. Because you all still have those because you love them so much and you really look after them. And every single person who's on this council or next year's council has their membership cards because they know how much I love our membership cards. If you don't have a membership card, you get in touch with me or when our secretary is there, you get in touch with our secretary, but we will sign you up. So just give us a $5. We'll sort you out. Hook you up. It's fine. Yes?
Any sign of those special honorary life membership cards yet?
So, next vote is for members only. Nice. Totally dodged that one well. And I will inform you of when there are developments there. Don't worry, it will happen. You will get them. They'll be super cool and worth the wait. So do you all have your membership cards ready? Okay. So this is on who you thought spoke best tonight. So if you thought that the proposition spoke best tonight, please raise your membership cards.
That's a credit card. That's an actual fraud.
I don't really find someone today. Okay, if you thought that the opposition spoke best tonight, please raise your membership cards.
It's in here somewhere.
You've got life membership, you don't need to be something.
Okay.
The only opinion you are.
And if you both sides spoke really well, please raise your membership cards.
Great. Is that a car?
Okay, so the opposition wins tonight.
I'll forgive you for
Well, Robbie, that's the end of that debate. What did you think?
Well, it was a game of two halves, I think, at the end of the day. We're just waiting for the next game. We're taking it one game at a time, as usual.
And if for some reason you've managed to find the screen but you don't know where else you can find the Literific, where can you find the Literific?
Well, fully information we're available through all ports. We're getting a new Instagram account, we're getting a new Snapchat account, literific.org if you're wishing to look at the old website. And we are, of course, on Twitter, QUB Literific.
Indeed. Well, until next time, keep debating.